Margaret Collins had lived in Portland, Maine long enough to understand that grief could settle into the corners of a home the way dust did. Quietly, persistently, without asking permission. 6 months had passed since her husband, Dr. William Collins, died of a sudden cardiac arrest, and she had reached a point where leaving the old 3-story house felt necessary. Every hallway reminded her of the years before their daughter Ava disappeared, and every silence reminded her of the years after. Packing the last of William's medical books was supposed to be the final step before handing the keys to the realtor. Instead, it became the moment that shattered everything she thought she knew about her life. She began that morning with the intention of closing one chapter before moving to Boston, where she hoped to rebuild a quieter, smaller existence. She had spent 7 years searching for Ava in shelters, hospitals, parks, and online databases, following every lead that ever surfaced. Nothing had ever pointed back to her own home. Nothing had ever suggested that the truth could be hiding behind the shelves she dusted every Sunday. As she sorted the final stack of anatomy textbooks William once used during his years as a surgeon, she tried to think of the move as a symbolic reset, one last attempt to separate herself from the ache of the past. When she reached the oak bookshelf dominating the east wall, the last row contained the oldest volumes, many from the early years of William's training. One book seemed wedged deeper than the rest. She assumed age or humidity had warped the spine. By the time she pulled it free, the sound she heard was unfamiliar, mechanical, and completely out of place in a home built a century earlier. It was the kind of sound that suggested intention, something designed, something planned. Then a soft internal shift came from behind the shelves, and the center section receded, revealing a dark rectangular space that had never been mentioned in any blueprint or deed. Margaret froze, unable to understand why her own house contained an opening she had never seen. The space beyond it didn't feel like a forgotten crawl space or an architectural quirk. It felt purposeful. She directed the light from the small flashlight she kept on William's desk into the opening, expecting old insulation, wiring, or debris. Instead, the beam illuminated objects she recognized instantly, even after 7 years of loss. A child's bedspread in pastel pink. A journal with a purple cover. A porcelain doll with faded paint. A family photo taken the Christmas before Ava vanished. For a long moment, she couldn't form a single coherent explanation. 7 years earlier, she had reported her daughter's disappearance as a likely abduction. She had replayed the day in her mind hundreds of times. Ava sitting in the living room after school, Margaret stepping into the kitchen, and then silence where her daughter's voice should have been. Detectives had searched the neighborhood, the surrounding woods, the waterline along Back Cove. No one had looked behind a bookshelf. Margaret stepped closer to the opening, drawn not by curiosity but by recognition. The items were too specific, too personal to belong to anyone else. On a makeshift nightstand lay Ava's journal. The cover had been a birthday gift, chosen because it was her favorite color. Margaret had spent years imagining where that journal might be. Left behind in some parking lot, hidden in some stranger's basement, or lying beneath wind-blown leaves somewhere she would never find. The truth felt far worse. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The date written at the top of the first entry pulled her backwards in time. October 15, 2016. The handwriting was unmistakably Ava's, neat, looping, earnest. The words beneath it formed a reality Margaret had never allowed herself to imagine. Ava wrote that her father had brought her into this space and told her she could not leave until she learned how to behave. The phrasing was innocent in its simplicity, devastating in its implication. Nothing in the last 7 years had prepared Margaret for the possibility that the person she shared a home with, shared meals with, shared grief with, was responsible for everything she had lost. The realization widened as she reread the line. For 7 years, she had slept on the other side of this wall, unaware that her daughter was trapped mere feet from her. 7 years of vigils, prayer circles, missing person flyers, and sleepless nights had all unfolded in the shadow of a truth she never imagined. The danger had been inside the house, not outside it. The sound of rain against the windows seemed louder now, echoing the October night when Ava vanished. Margaret looked again at the objects in the hidden room, details filling in the years she had tried to forget. The school project Ava never finished, the pink sheets she refused to replace after the disappearance, the doll she had once carried everywhere. The journal pages whispered a story Margaret was only beginning to understand, a story that had been buried beneath this home long before William's death. She stood in the quiet of the library, surrounded by boxes meant for a new life, and realized that everything she believed about her family had been based on a lie. The discovery of the hidden room wasn't an end. It was the beginning of the truth she had been searching for since the day her daughter vanished. Margaret remained standing at the edge of the hidden space, unable to determine where disbelief ended and horror began. The more she let her eyes adjust to the dim interior, the more details surfaced, details that did not belong to a temporary hiding place or a child's fort, but to a room someone had designed for long-term confinement. The bed was too neatly arranged to be accidental. The clothes folded on a crate were not the small outfits Ava wore at 14 but larger sizes, suggesting someone had prepared for years that Margaret never witnessed. Nothing about the space looked abandoned or accidental. It looked maintained. She stepped inside, feeling as though every memory she carried risked shattering under the weight of what she was uncovering. She moved toward the pile of belongings near the far wall. They were unquestionably Ava's, shirts with patterns she once begged Margaret to buy, a blue dress from the day she vanished, and clothing Margaret had never seen before. Someone had anticipated Ava growing up here, as if her life outside these walls had never been meant to continue. The opposite wall held marks carved into the wood. Several dozen small horizontal lines stretched upward in uneven intervals, each one labeled with a date in Ava's handwriting. It was the kind of thing a child might do to mark growth, except these lines told a story of confinement rather than celebration. Next to the last measurement was another, shorter line with the date written shakily. The ink smudged, as if Ava's hands had trembled while recording it. Margaret stared at those marks far longer than she intended, trying to understand the length of the imprisonment they represented. She counted them not because she needed the number but because each one felt like a year of guilt she could not escape. Her daughter had been a few feet away while she herself slept, cooked, and spoke with the man she trusted, the man whose absence she had mourned, the man she believed she had known. Her attention shifted to the floor. A small metal vent was embedded neatly near the ceiling, angled in a way that provided airflow without allowing visibility into surrounding rooms. In the corner sat a bucket lined with plastic and covered with a cloth, a detail that confirmed this space had been used as a long-term cell. Nothing felt accidental or improvised. Everything reflected planning. Everything reflected intent. Martha Green, the longtime housekeeper, arrived after hearing Margaret call her name. Margaret did not need to say anything. The open passage said it for her. The look on Martha's face was a mixture of disbelief and dread. She whispered that Ava must have been kept here, that someone had created this place with purpose. Margaret didn't respond. She focused on the fact that someone had maintained this confined world in secret while she lived steps away. She reached for the journal again, opening to the pages she hadn't yet read. The entries became more detailed as the months passed, describing the rules Ava was forced to follow. A later entry mentioned new clothing being brought in with no explanation. Another spoke of her attempts to test loose boards in the floor. One page described hearing activity in the library when William entertained visitors at night, visitors no one ever acknowledged. The journal did not read like a frightened child's attempt to make sense of punishment. It read like a record of survival. Margaret found an entry that made her chest tighten. It described an attempt to escape. Ava wrote that she made it out of the compartment one night when the door had not latched properly, that she nearly reached the front hallway before being caught and returned to the room. Ava wrote that the locks were changed the next day, and that the passage could now only be opened with a mechanism disguised behind the anatomy book Margaret had pulled hours earlier. Margaret stopped reading for a moment, overwhelmed by the realization that she had been at home during those years, unaware that her daughter had been inches away. The entries grew darker as they progressed. They documented changes in Ava's health, her confusion about her own body, and the moment she realized something was deeply wrong. A later entry mentioned a discreet doctor brought by William. The language was clinical and detached, describing results and conditions rather than compassion. The doctor had confirmed Ava's pregnancy. The words were simple, but the meaning was unbearable. Margaret closed the journal briefly, needing to regain control before reading further. The truth was no longer a question of interpretation. It was embedded in every page. Her daughter had been forced into isolation, manipulated, lied to, and violated by the person Margaret once believed incapable of such cruelty. And the entries suggested Ava had carried more than one pregnancy. The enormity of what had happened stretched well beyond her comprehension. She forced herself to continue reading. The journal concluded with Ava's final attempt to escape, an attempt that nearly succeeded. The last entry described her father threatening to take her somewhere more suitable, somewhere designed for girls who disobeyed. It ended with a message for Margaret, pleading for her mother to know the truth someday. Margaret pressed her hand over the page without fully processing the gesture. She needed answers. She needed justice. But most of all, she needed to know where her daughter was now. The journal made it painfully clear that the hidden room was not the end of Ava's ordeal. It was only the beginning. Detective Thomas Walker arrived with a familiarity that unsettled everyone in the room. He had carried the case of Ava Collins for 7 years and had lived with the weight of failure through every dead end, every false lead, every press conference where he stood beside a grieving mother without answers. When he stepped into the library and saw the open passage behind the bookshelf, the expression on his face shifted from professional composure to something closer to disbelief. He approached the hidden space slowly, examining it not as a discovery but as a revelation that redefined his entire understanding of the case. Margaret handed him the journal without speaking. She did not need to explain what she had found. The evidence spoke with a clarity that unsettled even a seasoned investigator. Walker read the first pages with deliberate attention, then moved to the later entries. His voice remained steady, but the tension in his posture revealed how deeply the words affected him. The journal documented daily routines, forced isolation, the steady tightening of control, and finally references to medical visits that should never have taken place in secret. It also recorded Ava's attempts to escape, the punishments that followed, and the pregnancies that Margaret had not yet allowed herself to fully comprehend. Walker looked at Margaret after finishing several pages, and she asked him to continue reading. She insisted on hearing everything, even the details that made breathing difficult. He read entries describing Ava's confusion about her changing body, her fear of the doctor her father brought in, and the moment realization dawned that she was pregnant. The entries were clinical, restrained, almost detached, as if Ava believed that emotional distance might protect her from the truth she was forced to endure. Walker paused more than once, choosing his next words carefully, but he followed Margaret's request and continued. The more he read, the clearer it became that Dr. William Collins had not acted in isolation. Journal entries referenced conversations Ava overheard, fragments about other girls, about placements, about people visiting at night. Martha, who had been standing near the doorway, stepped forward with a hesitation that suggested long-held guilt. She revealed that William often hosted late-night visitors she did not recognize, men who arrived in expensive cars and left quickly. She admitted that she had been paid extra to stay quiet about these visits, believing they concerned William's medical practice and private patients. She had never questioned the secrecy until now. Walker listened carefully, taking notes and asking precise questions. The information Martha provided aligned disturbingly well with the journal's references. Her description of visitors matched Ava's descriptions of voices and hurried conversations beyond the hidden walls. Walker informed Margaret that the case was now far larger than a single missing person investigation. It was connected to something organized, intentional, and deeply criminal. He reminded her that the hidden room indicated long-term planning, professional construction, and a level of secrecy that suggested outside collaborators. When Walker examined William's home office, he uncovered 2 sets of records, one legitimate, one concealed. The concealed files were far more meticulous. They included coded notes, patient numbers, and financial transactions unrelated to any known medical procedure. Several documents referenced infants, dates of birth, and destinations that were listed only by city abbreviations. The amounts recorded beside them were far higher than any medical service fee. Margaret recognized none of the names listed. The files suggested this operation had been active long before Ava disappeared. Walker pieced together what he could, forming a preliminary timeline. It became clear that William had maintained a second medical practice outside official oversight. The nature of the records suggested involvement in illegal adoptions. A pattern emerged indicating infants were transferred across state lines, often within days of birth. Some documents referenced prearranged placements and suitable recipients, terms that avoided direct implications but left no doubt about the nature of the transactions. Margaret struggled to absorb the growing magnitude of what her husband had done. She had lived in the same house, crossed paths with the same visitors, and believed every explanation he ever offered for his unpredictable hours and late-night phone calls. Everything she had assumed about the last decade was unraveling faster than she could process. The betrayal layered itself with guilt, forming a weight that felt both personal and impossible to bear. Walker continued searching through the room until he located a locked metal case hidden behind medical journals. Inside were photographs of young girls in various stages of adolescence. Margaret recognized none of them, and the expressions on their faces suggested they were not willing participants. Many of the photos included identification numbers written on the back, matching the codes in the financial records. Some were dated years before Ava disappeared. A letter caught Walker's attention. It was addressed to William from another physician, signed only as Dr. A. The letter congratulated William on a successful specimen and referenced twins born in Chicago. It also requested another girl with specific characteristics by a certain deadline. The tone was transactional, devoid of empathy, written as if discussing medical supplies rather than human lives. Margaret felt the floor tilt beneath her. Her husband wasn't just guilty of harming their daughter. He had been part of a network that exploited vulnerable girls for years. Walker explained that evidence pointed to multiple victims held at different times, not just Ava. The carved marks on the wall varied in height and style, indicating at least 3 or 4 individuals had been confined in the hidden room over a 10-year span. The truth grew darker with every discovery. William had maintained a system of selecting, confining, impregnating, and selling infants to clients across several states. The operation was deliberate, profitable, and sustained by professionals who concealed their tracks well. Ava had been the last girl kept in the hidden room, but she was not the only one. Walker assured Margaret that he would notify the federal authorities. The case now involved kidnapping, trafficking, illegal adoption, and medical conspiracy. He promised her that every lead would be pursued, every connection investigated, and every victim identified. Margaret did not ask for reassurance. She asked only one question: where her daughter might be now. Walker had no answer yet, but he vowed that the search would begin immediately. Martha Green stood quietly near the doorway while Walker organized the collected evidence, her expression shifting in a way that suggested she had more to reveal. Margaret sensed it even before the housekeeper finally spoke. The words came slowly at first, as if unlocked from a place she had kept sealed for years. She admitted that Dr. William Collins often met people late at night, strangers who came through the back in trance and stayed only briefly. She had never seen their faces clearly, but their cars were expensive and their demeanor carried a sense of purpose that didn't match William's usual community patience. She confessed that he had paid her hundreds of dollars over the years to ignore certain noises, certain locked doors, certain irregularities she never questioned out of fear or loyalty. Her voice wavered when she mentioned something she had hidden from Margaret. Months after Ava disappeared, she received a letter addressed to Margaret, but William instructed her to keep it secret. He claimed Margaret was too fragile and that seeing the letter would jeopardize her emotional stability. He gave Martha $500 and told her to place the envelope in the attic and forget it existed. She did as instructed, but now she regretted it more than anything in her life. Walker requested the letter immediately. Martha retrieved it from the attic, tucked inside a dusty shoebox. Margaret held the envelope as if it were something fragile, not paper but a missing piece of her child's life. The handwriting was unmistakably Ava's, older than the entries in the journal, shakier, but still hers. Margaret unfolded the letter slowly, preparing herself for whatever truth awaited. Ava wrote that she was alive but not safe. She explained that William had taken her to a remote location after the final escape attempt from the hidden room. The place was described as a farm near a lake, guarded and isolated. She mentioned other girls being held there, all forced into the same fate she suffered. She revealed she was pregnant again and becoming increasingly sick. She begged Margaret to find her, describing the location only by memory. A drive of roughly an hour from the Collins home, near Sebago Lake, in an area that felt rural and hidden. She ended the letter by promising she loved her mother, and by admitting that William had lied when he claimed Margaret wanted nothing to do with her. Margaret read the letter twice before she could breathe. The idea that Ava had been alive only 6 months earlier filled her with both hope and a suffocating sorrow. Martha's confession deepened the sense of betrayal. The letter had been in the house all along, while Margaret spent years searching beyond its walls. Walker shifted into action mode. He directed officers to pull the property records belonging to William Collins, not only in Portland but across all counties nearby. The search led to a cluster of holdings William had never disclosed to his wife: storage units, vacant lots, and, most importantly, a parcel of land registered under a secondary corporate entity he controlled. The land sat outside the city limits near the outskirts of Windham, aligned closely with the general location Ava described in her letter. It was a farm. It was isolated, and it matched every description Ava had written. Walker contacted his command and initiated a multi-agency coordination effort. Because the case involved possible trafficking and multiple victims, state police and federal authorities were notified. Margaret insisted she go with them, but Walker cautioned her about the potential risks. She refused to step back. She had spent 7 years searching in the wrong places. She could no longer accept being kept away from any step of the truth. The decision was made. She would ride in a separate unmarked vehicle, supervised but present. As arrangements were finalized, Walker examined the last details of the letter. Ava described guards, medical staff, and an organized system for managing pregnant girls. She wrote that infants were taken immediately after birth and that the girls rarely knew where the babies went. Ava had tried to track conversations, whispers, and small clues about buyers, but the information was always incomplete. She also mentioned a name: Dr. Harold West, someone the guards referred to with deference and fear. He visited monthly, checking on progress and deciding when girls would be moved. Walker recognized the name from similar investigations in other states. Not enough to arrest him without evidence, but enough to suggest the operation Ava described was only a small part of something larger. Margaret felt a cold certainty settle in. William had not acted alone. Whatever he was part of extended far beyond their household. While officers prepared for the operation, Marta handed over additional papers she found in William's private desk drawer: receipts, coded messages, contact lists with initials instead of names, and what looked like hospital discharge summaries that did not match any known patients. These documents created a clearer picture. The organization had access to medical expertise, financial resources, and a network for placing infants into homes illegally. One document confirmed something that turned Margaret's unease into the sharpest form of fear. It listed recent transfers, including one dated only weeks before William's death, relocated females, with vague notations beside each number. One number matched the code Ava used in her journal to refer to herself. Walker concluded that if Ava was still alive, she was likely still at that farm or another associated property. The urgency grew. Lives were on the line. By late afternoon, law enforcement mobilized toward Windham. Margaret sat in the back of the unmarked car, reciting every word of Ava's letter in her mind. She held the journal tightly, not for comfort but to anchor herself in the truth she had finally uncovered. She did not know what they would find in that rural compound. She did not know what condition Ava might be in. But for the first time in 7 years, she had a direction that felt real. She would not turn back. She would not be kept from the truth again. The drive toward Windham felt longer than any distance Margaret had ever traveled. She sat in the unmarked vehicle with her hands pressed against the worn cover of Ava's journal, repeating the same silent promise to herself. She would walk out of this day with her daughter. She carried no certainty, no guarantee, only the conviction that she could not endure another year, another month, another day of not knowing. Walker's vehicle led the convoy, followed by state police cruisers, federal agents, and an ambulance held in reserve for whatever they might find. No one spoke much during the ride. Every person in that line of vehicles understood that they were closing in on something far larger than a single missing person. As they neared the property boundary registered under Williams' hidden corporation, the team prepared for a tactical approach. Walker briefed them on what they might encounter: multiple victims, potential armed guards, and the likelihood of people attempting to flee once they realized law enforcement was closing in. Margaret listened from a distance, absorbing every detail that might bring her closer to Ava. She stayed focused on the words from Ava's letter describing guards, rules, and control that seemed absolute. She knew they had to move fast. The convoy turned off the main road and continued down a long dirt path that cut through the rural outskirts of Wyndham. When the structures came into view, Walker issued orders through the radio. Units positioned themselves around the buildings to establish a full perimeter. No one wanted to risk a warning reaching whoever was inside. The operation hinged on speed and coordination. Once Walker signaled the entry teams, officers advanced toward the buildings with deliberate precision. Margaret remained inside her vehicle until Walker confirmed the area was secure enough for her to step out. She could hear voices over the radio, commands, confirmations, and the tense updates of officers identifying movement inside one of the larger structures. She pressed closer to the window, unable to look away from the building Walker headed toward. It was the place Ava had described in her letter, the same place she had begged her mother to find. Margaret felt the weight of every year pressing against her ribs. Walker and the tactical team forced entry and moved inside. Moments later, a message came over the radio confirming multiple victims. Another officer reported that 2 men had attempted to escape through a back exit but were immediately apprehended by perimeter units. Margaret tried to steady herself, feeling every second stretch longer than it should. When Walker finally called her name, she stepped toward him with a mixture of fear and hope that nearly made her voice disappear. Inside the structure, she saw exactly what Ava had written about: a group of young women, some still teenagers, others barely adults, stood clustered together, each one showing signs of exhaustion that no teenager should ever know. Their expressions reflected both relief and terror as officers guided them out to waiting medical teams. Margaret scanned their faces, searching for the one she had memorized through photographs and memories. She didn't see it at first. The panic built inside her, tightening with every step. Then she heard a voice from across the room. It was faint, strained, and unmistakably the voice she had replayed in her head for 7 years. Someone called out to her using a single word she had longed to hear again: Mom. Margaret turned toward the sound and saw a young woman seated in the corner, barely able to support herself. Her hair was longer, her features older, but her eyes were the same. Those eyes were familiar enough to cut through every barrier between them. Margaret reached her daughter's side with a sense of urgency that eclipsed everything else around her. Ava was thin, her voice weak, and the outline of her pregnancy was unmistakable. None of that changed the overwhelming relief that washed over both of them. For the first time in 7 years, the distance between mother and daughter closed. Ava clung to the presence she had been denied for so long, whispering apologies she never needed to give. Margaret answered in a steady voice, assuring her that nothing was her fault, that every lie William ever told had been designed to keep them apart. While mother and daughter held onto each other, Walker coordinated the extraction of the other victims. Medical personnel evaluated each girl, documenting their conditions and determining who needed immediate transport. Some seemed too stunned to speak. Others seemed terrified of the officers trying to help them. It was clear that they had been conditioned to trust no one. The professionals moved gently, guiding them toward the ambulances waiting outside. A physician specializing in trauma, Dr. Patricia Monroe, approached Margaret and explained Ava's condition. She confirmed that despite severe malnutrition and stress, Ava and her unborn child appeared medically stable. The pregnancy was in its late stage, likely 7 months. Dr. Monroe assured her that Ava would receive comprehensive care at the hospital in Portland and that she would not be alone for any part of that process. Before leaving the building, Walker asked Ava a series of questions to understand the scope of what had occurred at the farm. Ava explained that 12 girls had been held across several structures on the property. The 2 men arrested were enforcers, responsible for carrying out orders from someone they referred to as Drive West. Ava explained that West visited the farm monthly to conduct examinations and determine timelines. She also revealed that newborns were taken immediately after birth, never shown to the mothers, and moved to unknown locations. Ava also shared something she had not mentioned in her letter. She spoke of a young man who had been held separately, someone she had come to trust in the limited ways she could. His name was Noah. He was taken away 2 weeks before the rescue. Workers at the farm had insisted he was no longer needed. Ava believed he might have been moved to another facility owned by the same organization. Margaret absorbed every detail her daughter could provide. There was no way to protect her from the trauma she had endured, but she could ensure Ava would never face it again alone as officers completed their sweep of the property. Margaret accompanied her daughter to the ambulance, remaining by her side while medical staff prepared her for transport. She refused to let go of her daughter's hand, as if reclaiming a part of her life that had been stolen. The ambulance doors closed gently, and the vehicle began its drive back toward Portland. For the first time in 7 years, Margaret felt something she almost didn't recognize. It was not relief, not yet. It was hope, fragile, trembling, and real. The days following the rescue unfolded with a pace that made the world feel unsteady. Margaret remained close to Ava through every medical examination, interview, and procedure, refusing to let her daughter feel abandoned again. Federal agents arrived at the hospital within hours, requesting statements from the victims, coordinating with state police, and preparing the groundwork for a case that was already expanding across multiple jurisdictions. Margaret listened as much as she was allowed, piecing together the enormity of the network that had stolen her daughter's life. Ava's condition was carefully monitored. Doctors confirmed that she had survived circumstances nearly impossible for a young woman her age. Her pregnancy was far along and required specialized care, but she responded well to treatment. Social workers, advocates, and trauma counselors formed a protective circle around her. Despite their presence, Ava remained anchored to her mother, treating the steady reliability of Margaret's voice as a lifeline after years of manipulation and isolation. In private meetings with federal agents, Ava described what she had endured with an emotional restraint that startled investigators. She explained the routines the organization forced on the girls, the expectations placed upon them, and the emotional tactics used to keep them compliant. She spoke of the medical examinations conducted by Dr. Harold West, a figure described by the other victims as clinical, distant, and methodical. He was the one who approved movements, transfers, and what he called placements, decisions that shaped the lives of infants taken from their mothers at birth. Agents compared Ava's testimony with the statements of the other rescued girls. The details aligned with disturbing precision. Several victims had been brought to the farm from out of state. Some recalled being transferred between properties depending on their stage of pregnancy. Others spoke of visits from individuals they never fully saw, people who evaluated their conditions and discussed them as commodities rather than human beings. The system was organized with a level of sophistication that suggested years of practice. Margaret watched the investigation unfold in corridors, conference rooms, and waiting areas. She never interrupted, but she listened carefully. The scale of the operation was far larger than what she had imagined when she first discovered the hidden room in her home. The realization that William had been part of something that stretched across New England filled her with a grief beyond betrayal. It meant Ava had been caught in a machine built to exploit dozens, perhaps hundreds, of vulnerable young women. Evidence from the Wyndham property helped federal agents identify patterns in financial transactions, corporate records, and medical licensing data. Several shell companies traced back to Drive West had been operating in Maine, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. Their paperwork was carefully crafted to avoid detection, with addresses that changed frequently and documentation that connected to various out-of-state clinics. Investigators suspected that West's network had trafficked infants for nearly a decade. One breakthrough came from a rescued girl whose memory connected a detail others had mentioned only vaguely. She recalled a basement clinic where newborns were taken minutes after birth. The babies were then transferred through a side entrance to a waiting vehicle. She remembered hearing the name of a city in Vermont spoken by one of the workers. Investigators cross-referenced this with financial data and found a rental property linked to West's corporation in Burlington. This discovery suggested the network spanned at least 6 states. As agents mapped the movement of victims and infants, patterns emerged showing how the organization profited from forced pregnancies. Newborns were sold to families unable or unwilling to navigate legal adoption processes. Many were falsely documented as abandoned or surrendered infants, with paperwork forged by medical professionals embedded in the scheme. The profit margins were staggering. Several records showed that infants were transferred to wealthy clients on the West Coast after first being funneled through New England clinics. Margaret found herself in a strange position, surrounded by law enforcement, legal experts, and medical staff, yet unable to participate directly in the work to uncover the truth. She stayed focused on Ava, providing what the investigators could not: stability. Ava leaned on her in the quiet moments, sharing memories of the other girls she had lived beside, the conversations whispered through walls, and the fear that had defined her days at the farm. Ava often spoke of Noah, the young man mentioned during the rescue. She explained that he had been held in a separate section of the farm, isolated from the girls but occasionally permitted limited communication. He had protected her emotionally in small but vital ways, offering reassurance when she felt her strength slipping away. Margaret listened to every detail, realizing how much Ava depended on the memory of a person who might not have survived the same ordeal. Federal agents soon learned that West's organization had maintained multiple male victims over the years, using them for specific reproductive purposes. Several had been relocated or had disappeared from the organization's records. Noah's name appeared in one file recovered from William's office. The file indicated that he had been transferred to another location weeks before the Wyndham rescue. The lack of details troubled investigators, suggesting that his movement may have been part of a larger effort to hide evidence following William's death. As information continued to unfold, the Department of Justice formally announced a multi-state investigation into West's network. Media coverage escalated quickly, though details were limited to protect victims. Margaret turned off the television each time a reporter speculated about the case. She focused on Ava instead, on helping her daughter navigate medical treatment, trauma counseling, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Ava's pregnancy brought urgency to the situation. Doctors prepared for an early delivery if complications arose. Ava expressed fear that her baby might be taken from her just as her previous pregnancies had been stolen. Margaret assured her repeatedly that she was safe, that no one would take anything from her ever again. While Margaret provided emotional support, Walker continued coordinating with federal and state agencies. He visited the hospital daily, updating the family on new leads, arrests, and property seizures. His determination seemed nearly personal now, as if solving the case was the only way to atone for the years he believed he had failed Ava. Each update made the truth clearer. The organization was collapsing, and its victims were finally being heard. But for Margaret and Ava, the collapse of the network meant only one thing: there were still missing pieces of their story. And until every victim was found, until every child taken from Ava was accounted for, neither of them would feel the full weight of justice. Federal authorities spent months assembling the case, gathering testimony, tracing financial records, and reconstructing the path of every victim they could identify. What had started as a missing person investigation in Portland had expanded into a multi-state criminal conspiracy involving doctors, administrators, drivers, and intermediaries who had all played a role in sustaining Drive West's network. It became clear that the organization had operated with layers of secrecy designed to withstand scrutiny. But once Ava's journal surfaced and the Wyndham property was raided, the system began to unravel more quickly than anyone anticipated. The Department of Justice convened a federal grand jury in Boston to review the evidence. Prosecutors recognized that the scale of the crimes demanded a comprehensive approach. They charged West and his 12 closest associates with an array of offenses: kidnapping, forced labor, human trafficking, medical fraud, conspiracy, and the illegal transfer of minors across state lines. The charges multiplied as more victims were identified, each one adding weight to the case. During this period, Ava recovered enough physically and emotionally to participate in the proceedings. Margaret supported her through every stage, from written statements to meetings with victim advocates. The legal process was complicated, but the federal team made sure Ava understood that her testimony was central to the prosecution. They needed someone who could speak not only to the conditions at the Wyndham property but also to the broader structure of the network. When Ava entered the courthouse for the first time, she carried the journal that had survived her years of confinement. She held onto it not as evidence but as a reminder of her endurance. Margaret remained by her side, her presence anchoring Ava as she prepared to testify in front of people who would judge the most painful chapters of her life in the courtroom. Ava was asked to describe how she was taken from her home, how William had manipulated her isolation, and how she was eventually moved to the farm near Sebago Lake. She explained the system imposed on the girls, the schedules, the medical checks, the restrictions, and the emotional tactics used to keep them compliant. Her voice remained steady even when describing the pregnancies, the infants removed from the mothers at birth, and the organization's rituals disguised as medical necessity. Her testimony extended over several days, each session ending only when it became clear she needed rest. Prosecutors presented documents recovered from William's office and West's corporate holdings, reinforcing her words with undeniable proof. They also explained how the financial records showed large payments made by couples desperate to adopt, many of whom had no idea they were participating in an illegal exchange. The defense attempted to discredit Ava's memory, suggesting trauma could distort details. Ava responded with clarity that made the courtroom silent. She recited dates, routines, and conversations with a precision that came from years of recording them in her journal. When presented with photographs of girls rescued from the compound, Ava identified each one by the name she knew them under, connecting faces to stories that had until then remained hidden behind sealed walls. Other victims testified as well. Their accounts echoed Ava's, strengthening the prosecution's argument that the organization had operated systematically, not haphazardly. Some victims were too fragile to speak publicly, but their written statements were read into the record. As the stories accumulated, the impact became undeniable. The court heard about manipulation, deprivation, coerced pregnancies, and a system that treated human life as a product. Throughout the trial, Margaret watched West closely. He appeared calm, composed, and detached, showing no sign of remorse or recognition. His attorneys argued that he was the victim of a conspiracy by disgruntled former employees and unstable patients. But the weight of evidence, photographs, financial records, coded files, and medical documents was overwhelming. Jurors remained unswayed by the defense, absorbing the truth in each piece of testimony. A significant moment came when prosecutors revealed a series of encrypted emails recovered from West's computer. The messages described intake schedules, projected delivery dates, and client expectations. One email congratulated William on a reliable source, referencing Ava indirectly. The correspondence illustrated how deeply William had been involved, not as a reluctant participant but as a fully invested collaborator. The courtroom reacted visibly when prosecutors read aloud the line referring to Ava as the most reliable subject. Margaret felt the words like a blade. When closing arguments began, the prosecution emphasized the systematic nature of the crimes. They portrayed West as the architect of a program that exploited vulnerable young women for profit. The defense attempted to claim that the government was exaggerating the scale, but the evidence stood too firmly against them. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days before returning a verdict. Guilty on all counts for Dr. Harold West. Guilty for every associate who stood trial beside him. The sentencing phase lasted weeks. Victims were invited to give impact statements. Ava's was one of the most powerful. She described not the suffering she endured but the life she wanted to reclaim. The education she lost, the safety she had been denied, and the children taken from her. She spoke not with anger but with a calm resolve that left the courtroom silent. Her mother stood behind her, one hand resting gently on Ava's shoulder, the support unspoken but deeply understood. The judge delivered multiple life sentences for West, ensuring he would never walk free. Several of his associates received decades in federal prison. No amount of punishment could erase what had been done, but justice had finally taken form in a system that had once failed to protect the victims. After the verdict, Ava sat quietly in the hallway outside the courtroom, absorbing the weight of what had just ended. Margaret sat beside her, offering a presence that required no words. The legal battle was over, but the journey to rebuild their lives had only begun. For the first time in years, Ava felt the possibility of a future that belonged to her, and no one else. In the months following the trial, life in Portland took on a rhythm that felt foreign yet quietly hopeful. Ava remained under medical supervision at the hospital in Salem while Margaret commuted regularly, dividing her days between work with federal advocates and long evenings spent beside her daughter and newborn grandson. The staff knew them by name now. They understood without needing explanation that this family was rebuilding something delicate and irreplaceable. Ava's son, whom she named Gabriel, became a symbol of the life she intended to reclaim. She cared for him with a devotion born not from fear or obligation but from the fierce desire to protect him from everything she had endured. Margaret supported her through every uncertain step: midnight feedings, medical check-ins, and the moments when Ava found herself overwhelmed by memories that surfaced unexpectedly. Progress was uneven, but she moved forward one honest day at a time. During this period, the FBI's task force expanded its operations across New England. More survivors were located. Some were older, some younger, each carrying a story shaped by the same system that had captured Ava. Margaret volunteered to work directly with survivor outreach teams. She spent hours helping families navigate reunification, identifying resources for long-term care, and advocating for victims who had no one else to speak for them. It was work she had never imagined herself doing, but it became the anchor that steadied her in the aftermath of everything she had lost. Meanwhile, investigators uncovered more details about the network's financial ties. Couples who had unknowingly adopted children through illegal channels came forward seeking guidance. Prosecutors established protocols to ensure that those who acted in good faith were treated with care while maintaining efforts to reunite birth parents with their children whenever possible. It was a process filled with ethical complexity, but Ava understood the importance of it. She often wondered about the children taken from her, and though she held no illusions about immediate answers, she hoped that someday the truth would find its way back to her. 3 months after sentencing, a letter arrived at the hospital addressed to Ava. The sender was identified as David, the young man who had also been held at the facility. Investigators had located him living with relatives in Colorado after his rescue. He wrote with a sincerity shaped by his own pain, explaining his desire to meet Gabriel and offering to reconnect if she ever felt ready. Avi read the letter carefully, unsure of what emotions it stirred. Margaret, reading it later, sensed hesitation not rooted in distrust but in the fragile balance Ava was still trying to maintain. Weeks passed before Ava felt clarity. She asked Margaret to help coordinate a meeting at a small community center in Portland where both families could feel supported. When the day came, David arrived accompanied by an aunt. He carried no expectations, offering only quiet acknowledgement of what they had both endured. Gabriel lay asleep in his carrier as Ava introduced him. David knelt beside the carrier, gently speaking Gabriel's name, and something in Ava's expression softened. A quiet recognition that healing sometimes began with the smallest gestures. Their conversations unfolded slowly over several meetings. They spoke not about rebuilding the life they had been denied, but about building something entirely new, one grounded in honesty, patience, and the understanding that they had both been shaped by circumstances they never chose. Ava understood that any future with David would require time, trust, and shared intention rather than the weight of forced connection. But she also understood that he was the only person who fully understood the shadows she was trying to leave behind. A year after the trial, Margaret and Ava moved into a small house near the outskirts of Portland. It had 2 bedrooms, a modest yard, and enough room for Gabriel's toys to scatter across the living room. Margaret found comfort in the everyday routines she once feared she had lost forever. Ava enrolled in a community college program for social work, determined to help others who felt unseen or unheard. She excelled in her classes, fueled not by ambition but by a belief that her past could serve a purpose beyond pain. David visited often and eventually moved to Maine to be closer. He and Ava did not rush toward labels or expectations. Instead, they built a slow, steady companionship rooted in shared resilience. When Gabriel took his first steps, both families were there. When Ava completed her first semester with honors, she celebrated with Margaret and David at a small cafe where no one recognized them as survivors of a national scandal. They were simply a young mother, a grandmother, and a supportive friend sharing a quiet victory. As time passed, Margaret noticed changes in Ava, subtle but profound. She no longer flinched at unexpected sounds, no longer carried her journal everywhere as a shield. She laughed more easily, trusted more freely, and began imagining a future that stretched far beyond survival. 2 years after the trial, Ava founded a nonprofit dedicated to supporting survivors of trafficking and coercive control. She named it the Harbor Project, inspired by the idea that healing begins with a safe place to land. The initiative provided counseling, housing support, legal resources, and community programs designed to help survivors rebuild from the ground up. Margaret became one of its most active volunteers, offering guidance and advocacy to families navigating crises that once would have overwhelmed her. On the day the Harbor Project opened its first full-service center in Portland, Ava gave a short speech. She spoke not about what she had endured, but about the importance of giving people back the dignity and agency that trauma had taken from them. Her voice remained calm, steady, and honest as she addressed a room filled with survivors, supporters, and families seeking hope. That evening, as the small celebration drew to a close, Margaret watched Ava carry Gabriel across the room while David gathered donated books for the center's new library. For the first time in a long time, Margaret felt a sense of peace that was not fragile but deeply rooted. Their lives had been fractured, but they had not remained broken. Ava paused beside her mother, placing a hand on her shoulder. She said nothing, yet everything was understood. Margaret looked at the lights of the newly opened center reflecting softly through the windows and realized that their story, though forged in darkness, had become something more than survival. It had become a reminder that even when humanity fails in the worst possible ways, people can choose to rebuild. They can choose compassion where there was once cruelty, truth where there was once deception, and hope where there was once despair. And in that choice, lives can change, not all at once, but steadily, quietly, and with a strength that endures. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today and for listening with such care to this story. Your presence here means more than you know. Every story we share is chosen with the hope that it can touch someone's heart, offer strength to those who may be struggling, and remind us all that resilience is possible even in the darkest chapters of life. Today's story carries a deep lesson about courage, compassion, and the incredible power of a second chance. It shows us that healing doesn't happen all at once, and that no matter how heavy the past may be, there is always a way forward when love and hope lead the way. If this story moved you, made you think, or simply made you feel less alone, we would be truly grateful for your support. To help our channel continue to grow and bring more meaningful stories to you, all you need to do is press the like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe so you won't miss any future videos. Your engagement helps us reach more people who might need a moment of comfort or inspiration. Thank you again for being here, for listening, and for supporting our small community. Your kindness keeps this channel alive, and we hope to see you again in the next story.